and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang, and joining me is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome on board.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me. The ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China is seemingly worsening by the day, with the two sides introducing fresh tariffs in a string of retaliatory moves. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we take a closer look at where the two sides currently stand in their ongoing trade spat, with the help of our panelists as third-party observers. Now, the U.S.-China trade spat, it spun into a higher gear. It shifted into a higher gear on July 6th when the Donald Trump administration introduced higher duties on a number of imported Chinese goods.
We have many countries where they have massive barriers and they have massive tariffs, and we have to follow. And you could call it retaliation, but I'd rather just say that we want reciprocal.
贸易战不可取，因为不会有赢家。 经济霸权主义更要不得，旗帜鲜明反对单边主义和保护主义。
And the effects of that move was also felt in South Korea as well. Trade pundits have reached a variety of different conclusions as to the root cause of the U.S.-China spat. So what's your opinion? What were some of the main reasons for this trade spat?
For many years, actually, America has considered that China has been, let's say, behaving on a not fair way when it comes to trade and other kind of practices. And the Trump administration right now has especially underlined the theft of intellectual property. According to their calculations, would amount to more than $200 billion a year, which is actually bigger than this trade deficit that they hold with China. So expectations toward China in America for many years were that, you know, with economical growth, a different behavior would ensue. And according to them, well, China hasn't been, you know, a fair trade partner in many respects.
Okay. And Fabian, what do you think each country is trying to gain as a result of this war?
Yeah, I think it's the underlying problem. It's a struggle for hegemonic power. Mm-hmm. So in recent decades, what we see is actually a global power shift. I mean, after the Second World War, the U.S. was the dominant power. Now we see more of a multipolar world, and China is on the rise. And just to put that, you know, accusation against China of like piracy, that they steal products, that they steal ideas, just to put that into perspective. Not too long ago, let's say 20 years before, the same accusations were raised against South Korea. Even before that, I know the U.S. has also sometimes accused Japanese companies also of you know, copying technology. I think the real problem is more like the U.S. has won like almost like a desperate last birth of strength. They want to keep their dominance. They want to keep their position. Yeah.
To not lose their hegemony.
Yeah.
Now, President Donald Trump, he has long advocated trade protectionism from the earliest days of his presidential campaign, speaking out against the massive trade imbalance between the U.S. and China. Now, Andres, you hinted that this might not have shifted into a higher gear had Donald Trump not been elected president. Do you echo that sentiment? Would this trade war not have occurred had Donald Trump not been elected?
Yeah, I mean, not in that escalative way. So Trump is the president that believes the least in free trade. And he's the one who is also, from his rhetoric, the most, you know, aggressive. And he also has a domestic voter base that he has to satisfy. So part of his, you know, rhetoric is also because of, you know, pleasing his voters at home. But of course, like another president, let's say someone from the Democrats, would have also, you know, strongly tried to protect the interests of U.S. economy. That's just very natural. But the way how Trump does it is highly problematic also because a trade of war can easily escalate into a real war.
Sure, war in other areas as well, right? So, Kabe, do you think that this trade war would have been inevitable?
I think so. It reminds me of 1980s. Back in 1985, highly advanced countries, 5 countries, Japan and the U.S., and West Germany and France and England, the top of the central banks and the finance minister gathered to New York and discussed about the appreciation of each currency against US dollar. For example, the dollar is devalued against yen from 240 to 120 in 1 year.
Yeah.
Then Japan export is struggled a lot. Then Japanese central bank, in order to stimulate Japanese economy, lowered the interest rate to 2.5%, which was a record low at the time.
Sure.
Then easy money went into the property market and the stock market. Then it is the beginning of so-called bubble economy.
Right.
Also, the aim of this trade battle is to ensure stronger protection on intellectual properties.
Sure.
So, and also Trump wants to make China compromise, made in China 2025, which is a $300 billion program. Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, the spillover effects of this trade war is being felt by South Korea as well. According to a study conducted by an economic think tank, South Korea was ranked 6th among the list of bystanding countries that would be most heavily impacted by the ongoing trade war. In addition, China and the US are the two biggest export destinations for South Korea, highlighting the country's vulnerability. What kind of impact will this trade war have on South Korean economy?
I mean, now we live in a global economy. It's so interlinked. When we look back 10 years ago, the bubble in the US, the real estate bubble, basically caused a crisis that was almost felt by all major economies. So I think what South Korea actually should do is to diversify its trade business and not only depend on the US and China, but to have like as many possible markets as possible.
Right. And speaking of diversification, the Moon Jae-in administration, he has spearheaded the so-called New Southern Policy and the New Northern Policy as part of its efforts to broaden its diplomatic reach.
신남방 정책은 싱가포르를 포함한 동남아시아 국가들과 사람, 상생 번영, 평화를 위한 미래 파트너십을 구축하는 것입니다. 내가 지난해 동방경제 포럼에서 발표한 신국방 정책은 신동방 정책에 호응하는 한국 국민들의 꿈입니다. 나는 한국과 러시아의 협력이 한반도 평화와 동북아 번영의 주춧돌이라고 생각하며 그동안 진심으로 노력해왔습니다.
Do you think these new policies will bring about significant change in the currently US-centric and the China-centric trade?
I think so, but in the East Asia market, I think there will be a fierce competition between Korean companies and Japanese companies. For example, in Vietnam, already Korean companies have much more presence than Japanese companies. So I think to Japanese companies, it's going to be a very challenging time.
Okay. Do you think investing in these new northern policies and new southern policies will help lessen the effect of this U.S.-China trade war?
Oh, most definitely. It could help. But then again, the span of this trade war is unknown, and I think uncertainty is the main factor here. We don't know how far this could go and how bad this could affect all the global economy, all major economies. They're so intertwined, and so many countries are, so heavily dependent on the Chinese supply chain. But of course, diversifying your trade partners is always a good thing. Not necessarily because of a trade war. It's always good to be less dependent on one single or two very big trading partners, as is the case with South Korea, yes.
But just looking at the numbers, the markets in Southeast Asia, especially, you mentioned Vietnam, growing really fast. Even the Philippines.
Sure.
I mean, you have some structural problems, but yeah, it's basically those are emerging markets, and there's a huge potential for, let's say, South Korea. I mean, South Korea has one unique asset, and the Hallyu High. I think it helped, shape the global image, the brand of South Korea a lot, and the image of South Korean companies became like much, like trendy and hip.
Okay, so moving away from South Korea to the global ramifications, the impact of the U.S.China trade war is being felt far and wide, with many media outlets expressing concerns over its global ramifications. Fabian, how is the trade war affecting the German economy?
Yeah, we shouldn't forget there's also a trade war against the European Union. And,
between U.S. and European
Union? Yes, exactly. So European Union reacts basically by countermeasures. So they also have punitive tariffs on U.S. products. So it's basically like a spiral, basically a cycle in which both sides probably have nothing to gain. And for Germany, I mean, the U.S. is the biggest exporting market. But in terms of the whole trade volume, China is now number one already since 3 years. So actually, I see that Germany will probably shift more towards China. But right now, if you look at the numbers, Germany has the fourth biggest trade surplus with the US. China is first, but Germany also has a high trade surplus. So basically, it's also a target for Trump to change that. And he already mentioned when he became a president, every Mercedes that drives on the streets of New York should be taxed.
Right, yeah. And how is the Spanish media covering this?
Well, I think in a negative light, as a country that is a member of the European Union and free trade being the foundation of the European Union itself, of course, the coverage towards anything having to do with tariffs, supporting free trade, of course, is covered in a negative light. And of course, in this case, media are kind of siding with China, despite it not being a traditional ally with Brussels, right? Spanish economy itself is not that exposed directly to either the U.S. or China. They're not the big trading partners in this case. France and Germany are. But then again, as this is a global issue, whatever starts happening to all big advanced economies will have effects on every economy, and especially given that they're Eurozone economies. So, yeah, the concern is definitely there.
Okay. So going back to President Trump, in explaining his trade restrictions on China, he said that he's acting in the interests of ordinary American workers and U.S. firms.
When you're losing $400 to $500 billion a year and it's going to China and coming away from our country and our taxpayers, I can't let that go on.
However, not every American citizen is happy about Trump's decision. So among the U.S. citizens, which groups stand to lose the most as a result of this trade war?
Well, I think it's those people who Trump considers to be the core American workers, like, for example, in the farming industry, in the steel industry, the people that he actually tries to protect with his economic policy. But actually, on the long run, I think they will suffer the most because, for example, for them, the exporting market is super important. What if, for example, the European Union will put some tariffs on U.S. whiskey? That's what they actually want to do. Then you have in Kentucky or so, you will have some unhappy people. But the problem with Trump or with U.S. politics in general, it's so emotional. It's basically like a social media fight of both sides who don't talk really. They don't share their logical arguments with each other, but they just fight. So I'm sure that Trump voters, even if they suffer from the policy making of their president, they can spin it in a way that they will make the other side responsible for that. And I don't think actually that Trump will lose a lot from his policy because he really has almost fanatic and irrational voters to some degree.
What about for China? Because Chinese President Xi Jinping made his position clear on the matter. On September 27th, he opined that China must take the path of self-sufficient economic growth. And with rising trade tensions with the U.S. back in August, he also drummed up public support to rally the people behind his cause. Despite China's iron will, however, its trade war with the U.S. looks to be a difficult battle for President Xi Jinping. How will Xi Jinping's political influence be shaped by the result of the trade war?
I heard a lot of criticism toward him, or you should be more humble something like this.
By Chinese?
Yeah, inside China. Yeah, but I don't think that he will lose power. He don't lose influence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of the
government political system.
I would actually say really to the contrary. I think he will maybe even gain from that because you have a high, I mean, the people are very patriotic, they are proud. And after all, it was Trump who started this trade war. So I think there could be some kind of victim mentality and we should, keep together and, basically fight against the U.S. with our own means, economic means, that is. So I think rather it will, just, he will maintain and even increase his power structure in the country.
So coming back to the U.S., on October 4th, Vice President Mike Pence claimed that China is actively trying to sabotage President Trump's support base in the U.S.
China is meddling in America's democracy. As President Trump said just last week, we have, in his words, found that China has been attempting to interfere in our upcoming midterm elections.
China's foreign ministry has fired back at Pence's remarks, calling them groundless and unwarranted. What are your thoughts on the accusations by Mike Pence?
Actually, I don't think they're groundless. I think his famous speech at the Hudson Institute, right? Well, actually, I think that's the core of what this trade war is really about. It's not only a trade war, it's actually, many analysts have said that, from one perspective, America actually was too naive and let China just behave this way for many decades. As we pointed out before, it was expected that, with a more open economy, a more open China would appear, but yeah, of course, there's a lot of, let's say, transnational investments that are not done in a very transparent way. There's a lot of issues that Mike Pence was pointing out there that actually are not groundless. They're there. Yeah. But the thing is, it's not actually the accusations, it's the tone. The tone was very aggressive, and it's spilling out to other areas which are potentially dangerous, and namely security.
Right.
But to put it simply, I think if you come up with such a strong accusation, you should need some proofs to back that up. And he was just citing intelligence information, and that's, I mean, that's too little.
Not enough evidence to back his
claims. Not saying, of course, I mean, the Chinese regime would be capable of doing so. It wouldn't surprise me that much, but it seems more like a strategic move, as you said, to, please the domestic voter base.
Okay. Now, aside from this trade war, Washington and Beijing are continually butting heads over a number of outstanding diplomatic and military issues. Concerns are being raised that this ongoing trade war will have an effect on ongoing negotiations regarding denuclearization of North Korea. On October 8th, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stood firm on Washington's stance regarding North Korea and trade during his meeting with senior Chinese state officials in Beijing, further ratcheting up tensions. Do you think that U.S. and China can continue to negotiate on North Korea denuclearization issues regardless of the trade war?
I'm not sure, but I can say that North and South Korea doesn't matter between relationship China and the U.S. They are keep focusing on promoting financial exchanges and cultural exchanges between North and the South. So I can say only like that.
Yeah, but I would agree. I think compared to the North Korea issue, even though that's much more dominant in the news, actually it's just a side battle. It's basically the real conflict is China and the US. And China has already shown publicly that they are not so much more on the same page as the US. For example, recently the foreign ministers of Russia, North Korea and China, they met and they made a strong statement for lifting North Korea sanctions. That, of course, angers the US. It's hard to establish like a causal relation effect. We don't know if it's directly related to the trade war, but of course, that would be one measurement or one method of China telling, okay, if you do that, then we do this.
Trade-off measures.
Yes.
Right. Now, back in July, President Trump blamed China of pressuring and influencing North Korea for the lack of progress in denuclearization talks. He also raised the possibility that China's dissatisfaction over its trade issues with the U.S. may have motivated these actions.
Relationship seems very good. I think it's probably hurt a little bit by China because China isn't really happy with what I'm doing on trade.
Do you think China could offer cooperation with the U.S. regarding denuclearization of North Korea as a sort of a bait or a trade-off, as you mentioned, in its trade issue with the U.S.?
I think there's a possibility that China will make full use of this opportunity. So, of course, to North Korea, it's going to be an opportunity to them because China is a member of Parliament Security Council in UN. So it has a very great influence. So North Korea might make use of this gap between China and the US.
Do you echo that sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the history of North Korea, they basically perfectionized the game of, playing out the Soviet Union against China and, basically cherry picking from each side. And yeah, they are probably also they will gain a lot if let's say the US and China and maybe even with the alliance to like South Korea, if they are all like, if there's a growing gap, then I mean, North Korea's position will actually get stronger. But one short point, so for China, for example, it's important to give them the opportunity, maybe to make a compromise with the US, but and publicly at least, they have to keep face. I mean, if it looks like backing down, I don't think that China will agree to it.
Right. Okay. What kind of countermeasures can South Korea take in case this trade war drags on into the future?
Well, of course, we've talked about diversifying trade partners, but I think actually this is a good opportunity for South Korea to diversify its economy, to be less reliant on its exports. I believe the GDP ratio is still around 40%, a little bit above that. This is actually a good opportunity for South Korea to, let's say, for example, relying more on domestic consumption, for example, and be less vulnerable to this kind of conflicts. I think it's a good chance for that, yeah.
Okay, and Sakabe, what can the government and also local firms do to turn this threat into an opportunity?
I want to make a stress that Korean companies should build a partnership with Japanese companies, because they can get good business partners. For example, in order to promote free trade, so FTA and RCEP, so they should consider about FTA. So, and also there is many examples that Japanese companies and Korean companies are doing business together in third country, for example, Indonesia and the Middle East. So because Japanese companies have more access to the capital, so Korean general construction companies is very cost effective, is so high, so they can make a win-win relationship. So I want to make a stress that they can good business partners.
Okay. Would you like to speak on Germany's behalf?
Yeah, well, if we look at Germany or at the European Union, I mean, it started as an economic project, but the reason why we have such a long-lasting peace actually in Europe is because we have the European Union, and also economically, Germany wouldn't stand against, fighting, or not fighting, but, competing with the US or competing with China. But Europe as a whole is pretty strong. And as you mentioned, for example, if the ties between South Korea and Japan would, if they would grow closer, and maybe ASEAN and East Asia, there would be something like a federation, maybe not as close like the European Union, but as a starting point, they would be much stronger unified in this battle of the global players, China and US. And on the midterm side, I think probably Moon Jae-in already did a quite good job of walking this fine line when they renegotiated the FTA with the US. I think South Korea, didn't lose that much. So basically they have to, please all different sides and, show some diplomatic strength.
All right. Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
The United States and China are commonly known as the G2, being the world's two largest economies as well as the world's two most influential political entities. With their actions likely to carry significant global ramifications, it is hoped the two sides can reach an amicable agreement to their trade issues through steady dialogue and collective wisdom. That's a wrap for this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.